Imagine a mafia organization so powerful, so deeply woven into the fabric of its country, that it operates out of an official office building, with a sign on the front door, with business cards, with a registered address the police already know about. Now imagine that same organization has more members than the entire military of its nation, that it controls the stock market, that prime ministers owe it favors, that when a natural disaster strikes, its trucks arrive at the disaster zone before the government does. This is not a movie, this is not a novel, this is Japan, and this is the Yakuza. In the 1960s, when American federal agents first encountered Yakuza members operating in Hawaii, they were stunned. Not by the violence, not by the tattoos, but by the sheer scale of what they were looking at. At the time, all American Mafia families combined had roughly 20,000 members. Japan had over 180,000 Yakuza. 180,000. In a country half the size of the United States, the Americans asked the Japanese government for information. The Japanese government said no, and the reason they said no was not political. It was not a grudge from the war. It was something far stranger. The Yakuza and the Japanese police had been cooperating for decades. Some Yakuza bosses were on a first-name basis with the officers assigned to watch them. So here is the question that is going to drive the next hour. How does a criminal organization survive for over 400 years, operate in broad daylight, shake hands with prime ministers, and still call itself the Mafia? The answer will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about crime, power, and the strange, complicated soul of Japan. March 11, 2011. A magnitude 9.0 earthquake strikes the northeastern coast of Japan. The tsunami that follows kills nearly 20,000 people and leaves over 500,000 homeless overnight. Within hours, the Japanese government is scrambling to respond. Logistics are broken. Roads are destroyed. Official relief convoys are stuck in gridlock 200 kilometers away from the worst-hit areas. And then something unexpected happens. Trucks start arriving in the disaster zone. Loaded with food, water, blankets, medicine. They are organized, efficient, and moving fast through routes the government has not even mapped yet. These trucks belong to the Yakuza. Japan's largest crime syndicate had opened its offices as relief centers within the first 24 hours. Members were handing out supplies directly to survivors with no media presence, no press conference, and no expectation of anything in return. This was not a one-time event. After the 1995 Kobe earthquake, the Yakuza had done the same thing, faster than the government, quicker than any aid organization, and entirely out of their own pocket. Now, before you start feeling sympathetic, we need to talk about what the Yakuza actually is. Because the earthquake story is just the beginning of a very long and very complicated contradiction. The Yakuza is a Japanese organized crime syndicate with roots going back over 400 years. At its peak, it had more active members than the populations of many major cities. It runs extortion, gambling, construction fraud, drug distribution, and far worse across Asia and beyond. And yet it has a code. A strict, written, enforced code of conduct that every member is expected to follow. Members are prohibited from stealing, not from rival gangs, from anyone. Theft is considered deeply dishonorable. Members are prohibited from unprovoked assault. Violence requires approval from above. Members are strictly forbidden from rape, an offense historically punishable by death within the organization. And members are prohibited from drug use inside the group. You are now looking at a criminal organization with a more detailed internal code of ethics than some corporations. A code that talks about protecting civilians, about loyalty to the clan above all else, about something the Japanese call jiri, a concept of duty and obligation that runs deeper than any written contract. The Yakuza calls itself a chivalrous organization. In Japanese, the term is Ninkyo Dantai, chivalrous association. This is not a label invented by journalists. This is what the Yakuza calls itself in its own official materials. And this mythology, however contradicted by reality, is what made ordinary Japanese citizens feel something closer to gratitude than fear when they saw those trucks pulling up after the earthquake. But where did all of this come from? What kind of history produces a criminal organization that genuinely believes it has honor? To answer that, we have to go back to feudal Japan, and to a card game with a very bad hand. The word Yakuza itself comes from a Japanese card game called Oicho Kabu. The rules are simple. 3 cards are dealt. The values are added together. The goal is to get as close to 9 as possible. If your total ends in 0, you have the worst possible hand in the game. And the worst possible combination you can draw is an 8, a 9, and a 3. In Japanese, 8 is ya, 9 is ku, and 3 is za, ya, ku, za, a useless hand, a worthless draw. The word that would eventually name one of the most powerful criminal organizations in history started slang for a losing card combination. The gambling groups who invented this slang, known as the Bakuto, were itinerant gamblers who ran underground card games throughout feudal Japan between the 17th and 19th centuries. They were outcasts, operating on the fringes of a rigidly hierarchical society. They called themselves and their losses Yakuza, useless, worthless, people that a decent society had no place for. But there are other theories about where the Yakuza truly came from, and none of them fully agree with each other. Some historians trace the lineage back to the Kabukimono, bands of masterless samurai who roamed Japan in the early 17th century after the wars that unified the country were over. These men had spent their entire lives fighting. Now there was nothing left to fight. They were trained killers with no employer and no purpose, and they terrorized the countryside, committed random violence, and formed gangs that answered to no feudal lord. They were the original outlaws. Others believe the Yakuza descend from a completely different group called the Machiyako, or servants of the town, ordinary citizens who organized to protect their communities from the very Kabukimono who were terrorizing them. By this reading, the Yakuza are not descendants of violent samurai. They are descendants of the people who stood up to violent samurai. This is the origin story the Yakuza itself prefers. A fourth group, the Tekiya, were traveling merchants who operated in the markets of feudal Japan. They were con artists and fraudsters who sold fake medicine, rigged games, and extorted money from anyone who came too close. But what made the Tekiya significant was not their crimes. It was their organization. They had a strict hierarchy, initiation ceremonies, codes of conduct, and a chain of command that looks remarkably familiar to anyone studying the modern Yakuza. The honest answer is that the Yakuza probably descends from all of these groups. Over centuries, the outcasts of Japanese society, the gamblers, the masterless warriors, the merchants with no scruples, and the vigilantes who became what they were fighting, merged into something new, something with its own identity, its own mythology, its own rules. And those rules were held together by a relationship unlike anything else in the criminal world. The relationship is called Oyabun Kobun. In Japanese, Oya means parent, Ko means child, Bun means role. The Oyabun is the father, the Kobun is the son. This is not a metaphor. In the Yakuza, this is a legally binding social contract enforced by tradition and violence. The Oyabun provides protection, guidance, employment, and a sense of belonging. The Kobun provides absolute loyalty, unquestioning obedience, and the willingness to go to prison in the Oyabun's place if necessary. That last part is not an exaggeration. There is a saying in the Yakuza that if the boss says a passing crow is white, you must agree. The Kobun does not question. The Kobun does not hesitate. If the boss commits a crime and someone has to take the fall, the Kobun steps forward. This was not coercion in the early Yakuza. It was considered an honor, an expression of the deepest loyalty a man could show. In 18th century Japan, the Oyabun-Kobun system mirrored relationships that already existed throughout society. The bond between a master and his apprentice, a lord and his vassal, a teacher and his student. The Yakuza did not invent this dynamic, they simply applied it to crime. And around this relationship, they built an entire world. A world with its own language, its own ceremonies, its own symbols written directly onto the body. There is almost no image more associated with the Yakuza than the tattoo, the elaborate, full-body artwork that covers members from neck to ankle. But the history of that tattoo is not what most people expect. In feudal Japan, tattooing was not a symbol of rebellion or identity. It was a punishment. Authorities would tattoo a ring around the arm of a criminal, one ring for each offense. The more rings, the more crimes. You could read a man's entire criminal history on his skin. It was a way to mark the outcast permanently, to make sure that no matter where he went, people knew exactly what he was. The Bakuto, the gambling groups, took this punishment and flipped it. If society was going to mark them as outcasts, they would make those marks beautiful. They covered the shameful rings with elaborate designs. Dragons, tigers, cherry blossoms, gods from Japanese mythology, warriors, demons. The full-body tattoo emerged as an act of defiance, a way of transforming a brand of shame into a symbol of identity and pride. But there is another layer to the tattoo that goes even deeper. Getting a traditional Japanese tattoo is not like getting a tattoo at a modern studio. The traditional method, called tabori, involves inserting ink under the skin using non-powered needles, manually, by hand, stroke by stroke. A full-body tattoo done this way can take hundreds of hours, thousands of sessions over years. Every single hour is painful. For the Yakuza, this was the point. The tattoo was a test, a proof. A man who could sit through 100 hours of tabori without flinching had demonstrated something about his character. He was patient, he was tough, he could endure. He was the kind of man you wanted beside you when things got dangerous. And the tattoo was also a commitment. You cannot hide a full-body tattoo. You cannot pretend you are someone else. Once a man was tattooed as Yakuza, there was no going back to ordinary society. No regular job. No way to disappear into the crowd. The tattoo was a permanent declaration. I belong to this. I chose this. And I am staying. The initiation ceremony that preceded the tattoo was equally permanent in its symbolism. On an auspicious day, the Oyabun and the new Kobun would sit facing each other before a Shinto altar. Offerings of fish, rice, and salt were placed in front of them. Sake was poured into ceremonial cups. They drank from each other's cups. This is the blood bond. After that moment, the Oyabun and Kobun were family in every sense that the Yakuza recognized, bound to each other more completely than most marriages, with obligations that lasted until death. And if a member broke those obligations, there was one final symbol waiting for him, the little finger of the left hand. In Japanese, the practice of cutting it is called yubitsumi. The logic behind the choice of finger is military. A samurai holds a sword primarily with the ring finger and little finger of both hands. Removing the little finger weakens the grip. A warrior who cannot grip his sword firmly is dependent on his clan for protection. Yubitsumi was not simply a punishment. It was a physical reminder of where you stood. You have been weakened. You need us more than ever. Stay loyal. Members who violated the code would wrap the severed joint in cloth and present it to their Oyabun as an act of contrition. In interviews recorded years later, former members describe the experience in ways that are difficult to explain. Some say the pain was immense. Others say they felt almost nothing, that the desire to make it right, to restore the relationship with the man they considered their father, overrode everything else. This is the world the Yakuza built around itself, a world of ceremony, loyalty, permanent marks, and extreme consequences. A world that looks, from the outside, like an elaborate performance. But from the inside, according to everyone who has ever lived it, felt completely real. And by the end of the 19th century, this world had grown powerful enough to reach somewhere no criminal organization had reached before, all the way into the Japanese government itself. To understand how the Yakuza became a political force, you need to understand Japan at the end of the 1800s. The country had just gone through one of the most dramatic transformations in modern history. For centuries, Japan had been a feudal society, sealed off from the outside world. Then, in 1868, Emperor Meiji came to power and decided to modernize. Within decades, Japan went from samurai and shoguns to factories and railways. It was a revolution by choice, and it was deeply unsettling to a large portion of the Japanese population, who felt their traditions, their identity, their entire way of life being swept away. Into this anxiety stepped a man named Mitsuru Toyama. Toyama was an ultra-nationalist who had grown up worshipping the samurai tradition and despised everything the Meiji modernization represented. He saw Western influence as a poison. He saw industrialization as a betrayal of Japanese values. And he had a talent for gathering people who felt the same way. Among those people were Yakuza. In 1881, Toyama founded an organization called the Genyosha, the Dark Ocean Society, a nationalist federation that combined political activism with organized crime. Former tequila gamblers and street enforcers sat alongside politicians and military officers. The Yakuza provided muscle, the politicians provided protection, and together they assassinated left-wing rivals, broke up labor strikes, and pushed Japan toward the aggressive nationalism that would define the first half of the 20th century. This was the first time, but far from the last, that Japanese organized crime and Japanese government would find themselves on the same side of history. The relationship deepened through the following decades. By the time World War II ended and Japan lay in ruins, a new figure emerged to define the bond between crime and power. His name was Yoshio Kodama, and for several decades he may have been the most powerful man in Japan that most people had never heard of. Kodama had made his fortune during the war through smuggling and black market operations across occupied China. After Japan surrendered, he was imprisoned as a Class A war criminal, but he was released on Christmas Eve 1948, and the reason for his release says everything about the world that was forming around him. The United States needed allies in Asia. The Cold War was beginning. Communism was spreading, and Kodama, with his vast network of nationalists, gangsters, and political contacts, was exactly the kind of person the Americans wanted on their side. What followed was one of the most extraordinary arrangements in the history of organized crime. The CIA secretly funded Kodama, and through him a network of Yakuza-connected nationalist groups, to suppress communist influence in Japan. Millions of dollars moved through channels that would not be publicly documented for decades. The Yakuza, enemies of the state in any conventional understanding, became informal allies of American intelligence. Kodama used this position to build bridges between the largest Yakuza syndicates in Japan and the conservative political establishment. He helped forge alliances between crime bosses who had previously been rivals. He brokered peace deals at the highest levels of the underworld, and then walked into government offices the next day as a political advisor. In the 1960s and 70s, he was simultaneously the political representative of Japan's largest criminal organizations and a respected figure in mainstream conservative politics. He held gangsters in one hand and government ministers in the other. The arrangement collapsed in 1976 when a massive bribery scandal involving the American aerospace company Lockheed engulfed the Japanese government. Kodama had accepted millions of dollars to use his political connections to steer Japanese military contracts toward Lockheed. The scandal brought down a prime minister, destroyed careers throughout the Japanese establishment, and ended Kodama's public life. He spent his remaining years under house arrest, in declining health, and died in 1984 before his trial was finished. But the infrastructure he built remained. The relationship between Yakuza and political power in Japan did not collapse with Kodama. It simply became less visible. The connections moved deeper underground, into back channels and informal agreements that continued for decades. Even in recent years, the shadow of this relationship has surfaced in unexpected places. In 2012, a photograph circulated showing former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe posing alongside a senior figure connected to Japan's largest Yakuza syndicate. Investigative journalists reported on payments allegedly made to a Yakuza associate during political campaigns. These allegations were never fully prosecuted, but they were never fully disproved either. In Japan, the line between legitimate power and organized crime has never been as clear as outsiders might assume. While Kodama was building his empire of influence in the 1960s and 70s, something equally remarkable was happening in the Japanese economy. The country that had been bombed to rubble in 1945 was becoming an economic superpower. By 1968, Japan was the third largest economy in the world, and by the mid-1980s, it was experiencing something that economists still talk about as one of the most extraordinary and ultimately catastrophic financial episodes of the 20th century, the Japanese asset bubble. From 1986 to 1990, real estate and stock prices in Japan exploded to levels that, in retrospect, make no rational sense. At the peak of the bubble, the land beneath the Imperial Palace in Tokyo was theoretically worth more than all of the real estate in California. The Tokyo Stock Exchange briefly became the largest in the world by market capitalization. Money was flowing everywhere, and the Yakuza, with their long experience in construction, gambling, and financial manipulation, were perfectly positioned to take advantage. This era produced one of the most unusual figures in the history of organized crime. Susumu Ishii, the head of the Inagawa-kai syndicate in Tokyo, was by the late 1980s one of the wealthiest men in Japan. His personal fortune was estimated at over $1.6 billion. He was not the Yakuza boss of popular imagination, tattooed and menacing in a dark suit. He was polished, educated, and preferred negotiation to violence. He invested in real estate across multiple countries, maintained a network of law firms in Japan and abroad, and was reportedly in contact with international figures including, according to some accounts, Manuel Noriega, the Panamanian dictator. Under Ishii, the Inagawa-kai became something remarkable. A criminal organization that had learned to extract wealth not through extortion or drug sales, but through financial markets. His men sat in on shareholder meetings. They built positions in publicly traded companies. When the markets moved, they were often the ones who had moved them. But the most sophisticated financial weapon the Yakuza developed during this period was not market manipulation. It was a practice called sokaya. The mechanics were almost elegant in their audacity. A group of Yakuza would purchase a small number of shares in a major corporation. This made them official shareholders with the legal right to attend annual general meetings. Before the meeting, they would spend weeks collecting every piece of damaging information they could find about the company. Undisclosed liabilities, affairs involving senior executives, labor violations, tax irregularities, environmental crimes, anything that could be used. Then they would approach the company's leadership privately. Pay us, or we will read all of this out loud in front of every shareholder, every journalist, and every regulator who attends the meeting. In Japan, where corporate reputation is treated with an almost sacred seriousness, this threat was devastating. The vast majority of companies paid. Some paid for years. By the early 1980s, sokaya had become so pervasive that the Japanese government passed a law specifically prohibiting companies from making payments to Yakuza shareholders. The law had an immediate and completely unintended consequence. Instead of reducing sokaya, it drove the practice underground and made the payments harder to trace. Companies simply became more creative about how they moved money. The most effective countermeasure that eventually emerged was not a law. It was a coordination agreement. Japan's largest corporations began scheduling their annual general meetings on the exact same day. If every major company holds its shareholder meeting simultaneously, no extortion group can be in two places at once. By the 1990s, more than 90% of companies listed on the Tokyo Stock Exchange were holding their meetings on a single coordinated day each spring. That detail, perhaps more than anything else, illustrates the scale of what the Yakuza had achieved in the corporate world. You do not redesign the entire calendar of Japan's financial sector because of a minor inconvenience. You do it because the threat is real, it is widespread, and you have run out of better options. At the same time they were operating in finance, the Yakuza were extending their tentacles into another world that proved equally lucrative and considerably more glamorous. Japan's entertainment industry. The relationship between organized crime and entertainment is not unique to Japan. But in Japan, it took on a particular character shaped by the country's culture of absolute deference to management. In the entertainment industry, that management structure was often controlled, directly or indirectly, by Yakuza-affiliated talent agencies. The way it worked was straightforward. Nightclubs and bars had always had a relationship with local Yakuza groups who provided protection in exchange for monthly payments. These venues were also where entertainment talent was discovered. Singers, actors, comedians, all of them started in clubs, and the clubs were Yakuza territory. Over time, the talent agencies that manage these performers developed the same relationships with the same organizations. A police document leaked in 2007 revealed that several of Japan's most prominent talent management companies were regular clients of organized crime groups. The boss of one of the largest Yakuza factions in Tokyo, a man named Tadamasa Goto, was reportedly exercising control over entertainment companies and their rosters of actors and musicians through a network of intermediaries, with full knowledge of the authorities who were nominally supposed to be investigating him. The consequences for people caught inside this system could be severe. In one case that attracted widespread attention, a young woman who had become one of Japan's most recognizable faces in television and advertising found herself trapped in a management contract that she could not legally exit. Journalists who investigated reported that the company holding her contract had connections to organized crime, that she had been subjected to controlling behavior, including being pressured to take prescribed medications to maintain her performance schedule, and that when she tried to leave, she was threatened with having damaging information released to the press. The leverage available to organized crime in this environment was enormous. Japan's entertainment industry operates on a system of exclusive representation and industry-wide blacklisting. A talent agency with Yakuza connections does not need violence to control a performer. It simply needs to make a few phone calls, ensuring that no other agency or broadcaster will work with someone who steps out of line. In an industry where visibility is everything, invisible exclusion is a sentence. The most dramatic illustration of Yakuza power over entertainment came not from inside the industry, but from a direct confrontation with an outsider who tried to expose it. In 1992, the director Juzo Itami released a film called Minbo, a dark comedy in which Yakuza members were portrayed not as fearsome warriors of the underworld, but as petty extortionists and cowards who could be defeated by an ordinary lawyer willing to stand up to them. The Yakuza were not amused. Shortly after the film's release, Itami was attacked outside his home. Several men slashed his face deeply enough to leave permanent scars. The message was unmistakable. This is what happens when you make us look weak. And yet the film had made a point that was difficult to ignore. By 1992, the image of the Yakuza as an honorable, chivalrous organization protecting the social fabric was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. The scandals had piled up, the violence had spilled too often into civilian spaces, and Japan's tolerance for the arrangement it had maintained for decades was finally reaching its limit. What made the Yakuza so difficult to simply arrest and imprison was the peculiar relationship it had developed with the institution most responsible for arresting and imprisoning people, the Japanese police. The relationship between law enforcement and organized crime in Japan is unlike anything that exists in comparable countries. It is not simply corruption, though corruption certainly played a role. It is something more structural, more cultural, and in some ways more genuinely strange. For decades, major Yakuza syndicates operated semi-openly in Japan. Their offices had signs. Their bosses were known by name to every officer assigned to the relevant precincts. There was a familiarity between police and Yakuza that, to an outside observer, looks almost absurd. Officers and gang members who had known each other for years would greet each other by name on the street. After a shooting or a gang conflict, Yakuza bosses would sometimes hold press conferences, acknowledging what had happened and announcing whether any civilians had been harmed. They were operating in the space between the legitimate and the criminal, as though the boundary were more of a suggestion than a wall. Part of this was ideological. The conservative nationalism that had connected Yakuza to politicians for generations also connected them, in a looser way, to the police. Officers and gang members often shared a common worldview, a belief in hierarchy, tradition, and the importance of maintaining social order, even if their methods differed considerably. A Japanese police inspector in the 1970s was famously quoted describing certain Yakuza bosses as honorable and chivalrous men who embodied the true spirit of Japan. The practical dimension was equally significant. When gang conflicts broke out, Yakuza organizations would sometimes approach police to negotiate a truce, acting as a kind of parallel judiciary that resolved disputes the formal legal system would have struggled to handle. When a murder occurred and a Yakuza member was responsible, it was not unheard of for the perpetrator to walk into the nearest police station and confess voluntarily, because the code required accepting consequences for your actions, and prison, while unpleasant, was preferable to the dishonor of running. The reciprocal arrangements could also work in the other direction. In 1983, the Japanese press revealed that police officers across multiple prefectures had been accepting bribes from Yakuza groups, receiving payments of up to $20,000 to look the other way on specific criminal operations. The resulting investigation led to the disciplining or dismissal of more than 120 officers. It was a scandal large enough to shake public confidence in the police. But it was also treated, by much of the media and political establishment, as a failure of individual officers rather than evidence of a systemic arrangement that everyone already knew existed. But there are only so many scandals a society can absorb before it demands action. And by the early 1990s, Japan had absorbed quite a few. The Lockheed scandal, the Sokaya revelations, a wave of gang wars that had killed civilians, the financial institutions that had made billions of dollars in loans to Yakuza-connected real estate developers during the bubble, loans that turned catastrophically bad when the bubble burst, leaving Japanese banks holding hundreds of billions of dollars in bad debt. The economic crisis that followed the collapse of the bubble was the worst Japan had experienced in 40 years. And the Yakuza were, to a significant degree, implicated in the recklessness that caused it. On March 1, 1992, the Japanese government passed the Act for Prevention of Unjust Acts by Organized Crime Group Members, known in Japan as the Butaiho. For the first time in the country's history, the Yakuza was officially designated as a social evil. Specific legal mechanisms were put in place to restrict the ability of known gang members to conduct business, sign contracts, rent office space, or open bank accounts. The Yakuza's response was immediate, and in retrospect, almost comically revealing of how confident the organization had become. They organized public demonstrations, held press conferences denouncing the law as discriminatory, filed lawsuits arguing that their civil rights were being violated. The spectacle of a criminal organization suing a democratic government for infringing on its constitutional freedoms was not lost on the Japanese public. Some found it outrageous. Others found it, despite everything, oddly compelling. But the law did not work in the way its architects had hoped. The Yakuza did not dissolve. They adapted. Members who had been official, registered gang members, with their names on rosters that police had maintained for decades, began quietly withdrawing from formal membership. They became what the Japanese called Junkosein, associate members, people who worked alongside the gang, performed tasks for the gang, benefited from the gang's protection, but who could not technically be identified as members under the new legal framework. The effect of the law was to make the Yakuza harder to see, not smaller but less visible. It drove the organization into the shadows precisely at the moment when those shadows were becoming more dangerous. Because the economic collapse of the early 1990s had already forced the Yakuza to look outward. The comfortable domestic arrangements that had sustained them for generations, the protection payments from bars and clubs, the Sokaya campaigns against corporations, the construction fraud, the domestic drug markets, all of these had either dried up or become too risky under the new legal environment. So they went international. The Yakuza had already established a presence in Hawaii and on the American mainland as early as the 1970s, operating through Japanese community networks and eventually making contact with established criminal organizations in cities like Los Angeles, San Francisco, and New York. In New York, the initial contact was with the traditional Italian-American organized crime families, the so-called Five Families, who controlled criminal activity across the city. The New York police, aware of the Yakuza's presence, initially dismissed them as too geographically inconvenient to pose a serious threat. They were wrong. Within a year of that assessment, New York investigators discovered that the Italian mob and the Yakuza had reached an agreement, cooperating primarily on large-scale gambling operations. From the perspective of the American families, the Yakuza were not competitors. They were potential partners with different client bases and complementary capabilities. In Russia, the post-Soviet chaos of the 1990s created opportunities that the Yakuza were quick to recognize. Former KGB officers and military veterans had formed their own criminal enterprises, and these groups were eager to establish relationships with organized crime networks in East Asia. The trade that developed was, in its way, grimly logical. Japan had high-quality stolen cars. Russia had weapons. The exchange moved in both directions, with the maritime routes between the Russian Far East and the Japanese archipelago functioning as a pipeline for both. The most dramatic international arrangement, which ultimately came to nothing, involved the Colombian cocaine cartels. In the early 1990s, representatives of the Cali cartel reportedly made direct contact with senior figures in the Yamaguchi-gumi, Japan's largest syndicate, to explore the possibility of introducing cocaine into the Japanese market in large quantities. Japanese police intelligence had detailed awareness of the negotiations and prepared for what they expected would be a flood of the drug into the country. The flood never came. For reasons that have never been fully explained, the Colombians did not follow through. One theory is that the Japanese market, with its enormous wealth but also its highly effective internal surveillance and very different drug culture, was simply too difficult to penetrate at the scale the cartels required. Another is that the Yakuza themselves were uncertain about disrupting a domestic drug market they already controlled. Whatever the reason, the alliance that international law enforcement had feared most never materialized. What did materialize, with far worse consequences for the people caught in it, was the systematic trafficking of women across Asia. In the 1990s, Yakuza-connected networks recruited women from the Philippines, Thailand, South Korea, Taiwan, and other countries with promises of legitimate employment in Japan as hostesses, entertainers, or service workers. The promises were false. Women who arrived in Japan found themselves indebted to the people who had arranged their travel, their housing, their documentation. The debt was structured to be unpayable, and the work they were forced into was not what they had been told. This was not a small operation running on the margins. According to investigators from multiple countries and documentation gathered by international law enforcement agencies, the networks involved were generating hundreds of millions of dollars per year across the region. It was one of the largest and most sustained operations of its kind anywhere in the world during that decade. Alongside the trafficking, the methamphetamine trade had become the Yakuza's most reliable source of income. This was not a new relationship. During World War II, the Japanese military had distributed methamphetamine to soldiers to suppress fear and fatigue. After the war, enormous stockpiles of the drug remained, and the Yakuza had been among the first to recognize its commercial potential, distributing it throughout Japan in the late 1940s and 1950s. By the 1990s, the supply chain had become thoroughly international, with production centered in parts of East and Southeast Asia and distribution networks extending across the Pacific. All of this, the trafficking, the drug operations, the international alliances, was happening at the same time as the legal pressure from the Botaiho law was intensifying. The result was a Yakuza that was simultaneously shrinking in terms of official membership and expanding in terms of the harm it was causing. Less visible, more dangerous. And internally, something else was happening that none of the anti-gang legislation had anticipated. The organization was beginning to change in ways that the old guard found deeply alarming. The Yakuza that had endured for 4 centuries was built on a specific set of values: loyalty, hierarchy, ritual, a code that, however hypocritically applied, at least existed as a framework for behavior. The generation of bosses who came to power after the war, men like Kazuo Taoka of the Yamaguchi-gumi and Kakuji Inagawa of the Inagawa-kai, maintained that framework with iron discipline. They were believers, not just in the organization, but in what the organization was supposed to represent. Taoka, known as the Bear because of a scar he received in a knife fight in his youth, built the Yamaguchi-gumi from a regional labor brokerage in the port city of Kobe into Japan's largest and most powerful crime syndicate. By the late 1970s, he commanded over 100,000 members across 36 of Japan's 47 prefectures. He survived an assassination attempt in 1978 when a gunman from a rival group shot him in the neck at a Kyoto nightclub. He crawled out, was rushed to hospital in an armored Cadillac, and recovered. The gunman was found dead on a mountainside near Kobe several weeks later. Taoka died in 1981 of a heart attack, and his funeral drew 1,300 Yakuza from 200 separate gangs. Flowers arrived from across the country. When Taoka died, the organization faced a succession crisis. In a decision that remains remarkable in the history of the underworld, it was his widow, Fumiko Taoka, who temporarily assumed control of Japan's most powerful criminal empire. She held it together for 3 years, while the internal political maneuvering to identify a permanent male successor resolved itself. Inagawa, who led the Tokyo-based syndicate that bore his name, was a different kind of figure. Shrewd, patient, deeply averse to unnecessary violence. He had cultivated relationships at the highest levels of Japanese society over decades and had a gift for making the Yakuza seem, to the people it needed to seem legitimate in front of, almost respectable. These were the last of the great bosses who had come of age during and immediately after the war, and when they went, they took something with them that could not be replaced. The young men who rose to prominence in the 1990s and 2000s were the products of a different Japan, a more prosperous Japan. A Japan where the post-war mythology of rebuilding together, of shared sacrifice and collective identity, had faded into the background noise of consumer culture. These men had not grown up in the rubble of bombed cities, where the Yakuza had been the only organization providing food and order. They had grown up in shopping malls and video game arcades. They understood money. They understood hierarchy only insofar as it served their ambitions. The old bosses began complaining about the new generation in terms that sound familiar from any institution watching itself change. Tokutaro Takayama, a longtime leader of a Kyoto-based gang, told a journalist in the early 2000s that the young members no longer cared about obligations, tradition, respect, or dignity. "There are no rules anymore," he said, and he was not wrong. The initiation ceremonies continued. The sake cups were still poured, the oaths were still sworn. But the depth of feeling behind them was different. Where previous generations had seen the Oyabun relationship as a genuine surrogate family, something that filled a void left by poverty, displacement, or social exclusion, the new members increasingly saw it as a business arrangement. They were loyal to their boss as long as the boss was profitable. They followed the code as long as following it was convenient. When it was not, they found reasons to ignore it. The statistics tell the clearest version of this story. From a peak of over 180,000 members in the early 1960s, the Yakuza had fallen to approximately 80,000 by the mid-1990s, following the Botaiho Law. By the 2010s, estimates put the number below 30,000. Today, the organization that once dwarfed the Japanese military is a fraction of its former self, aging, fragmented, and struggling to recruit in a country where young people have other options and other appetites. The Yamaguchi Gumi, the syndicate that once commanded more members than some nations' armies, split dramatically in 2015 when a large faction broke away to form a rival group. The split was not ideological, it was financial, a dispute over how much money regional bosses were required to send upward to the national leadership. The organization that had survived assassination attempts, natural disasters, government crackdowns, and international competition could not survive an argument about accounting. For former members who eventually find their way out, the path back to ordinary life is difficult in ways that go beyond the obvious. The tattoos that were once a source of pride become a practical barrier. Japan's strict social conservatism means that heavily tattooed individuals are excluded from public pools, gyms, hot spring resorts, and many workplaces. The criminal record compounds everything. Former members describe the experience of trying to re-enter society as a version of what the original Bakuto gamblers experienced when they were first excluded from it, marked, unwanted, having to rebuild an identity from nothing. Some succeed. There are former Yakuza who have written books, given lectures, started businesses, become vocal advocates for rehabilitation programs and changes to Japan's reintegration policies. Their stories are not simple redemption narratives. The crimes they committed were real. The people they hurt did not have their suffering erased by a change of heart. But the stories exist, and they are part of the full picture. The government now runs programs specifically designed to help former Yakuza members rejoin the workforce, providing job placement assistance and counseling. Whether this is compassion or pragmatism is difficult to say. Probably both. A former gang member who cannot find legitimate employment is a former gang member with every incentive to return to the only world that will have him. Step back from the individual stories, from the crime statistics and the court cases and the international operations and the financial scandals, and something else comes into view. Something that requires a different kind of question. Why did the Yakuza survive for so long? Not why did criminals exist. Criminals exist everywhere, in every society, in every era of human history. The question is why these particular criminals, operating in this particular country, were able to build an organization that lasted 400 years, reached into the government, the stock market, the entertainment industry, and the police, and was accepted, often tacitly and sometimes explicitly, by the society it operated within. The answer, uncomfortable as it is that Japan needed the Yakuza, or at least, at various points in its history, Japan found the Yakuza useful in ways that no official institution was equipped to be. During the post-war chaos, the Yakuza fed people the government could not reach. During the economic miracle, the Yakuza provided construction labor and capital in markets where legitimate financing was unavailable or too slow. During times of social conflict, the Yakuza resolved disputes through violence, yes, but also through negotiation, in ways that kept those disputes from escalating into something worse. And throughout, the Yakuza maintained a mythology of honor and duty that reflected, in its dark mirror way, values that Japanese society genuinely held. When Japan changed, the Yakuza changed with it. As the country became more prosperous, more legally sophisticated, more internationally connected, the arrangements that had made the Yakuza tolerable became intolerable. The 1992 law was not the beginning of the end. It was the formal acknowledgement of an end that had been coming for years. What the Yakuza leaves behind, as it shrinks towards something that may eventually be irrelevant, is a question that Japan has not fully answered. The disputes that the Yakuza used to mediate do not disappear because the Yakuza is no longer there to mediate them. The communities that the Yakuza protected, however problematically, still exist. The social pressures that drove young men into criminal organizations for 4 centuries have not been resolved by the passage of a law. Every institution that declines leaves a vacuum. The question is always what fills it. In the beginning of this story, there was a Yakuza office building with a sign on the door, a business card, a registered address. The police knew it was there. The government knew it was there. The people who walked past it every day knew it was there. And Japan, for reasons that took us 60 minutes to understand, chose to let it stand. Now the offices are closing. The signs are coming down. The business cards are being thrown away. And Japan is left with the question that every society eventually has to ask about the compromises it made to maintain its sense of order. Was it worth it?